is traditionalism necessarily fatalist, historically speaking? And I will show that that's not the case, and I'll explain why. But I think the question is very important. It's something to keep in mind, and that's something that, because if you keep it in the back of your mind, you accept it, and then you accept its consequences that, in my view, go against almost certain imperatives that we have. All right, so but I do want to say there is a difference between when I say there is perfection, right? And I say divine contact with humanity, and a certain kind of perfection. The question is, what kind of perfection are we talking about? How do you separate that from... Now, Ira Lapidus is a downright secular historian who is almost fated to say that Islam did nothing new. It's just like if you're a social historian, and then you're either an Orientalist who's motivated by a sort of a traditional Christian Orientalist perspective that Islam was evil, or you're motivated by something like Edward Said perspective, which is that Islam and the West are one and the same thing. Islam is really nothing. So don't blame it because it doesn't really exist. It's just like people are people. So that's the second perspective, where Islam equals nothing. It doesn't exist as a socio-political structure. It doesn't do anything new. So when I make this statement, I'm making this statement about a different realm. I'm making this statement about perfection in what Muslims seek, which is perfection of our inner connection to God. And the two domains are not disconnected for Muslims, meaning our socio-political success, longevity, stability, prosperity, are things that are in some complicated way connected to our spiritual success, right? Allah says in the Quran, for example, to the people of Nuh alayhi salam says to people, مَا لَكُمْ لَا تَرْجُونَ لِلَّهِ وَقَارًا, right? That famous ayah, everybody know? Why do you not turn to Allah? وَقَدْ خَلَقَكُمْ أَطْوَارًا. That Allah has created you, and then He says, if you do so, what happens? Allah will send skies raining and the earth will grow. In other words, worldly prosperity if you ask for forgiveness. So there is, in the past, there is a stronger connection in these verses between spiritual or religious commitment to God and worldly prosperity. But this is not a social causation, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also in the Quran other threads that we must put together, right? Because causality means one thing always leads to another. So you would say, if you're pious, you'll always be successful. Whereas Allah says in the Quran that whenever believers believe, when they say they're done, what happens to them? They're tested with difficulty. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين. It is a different causality here. So spiritual causality is different from what we may call civilizational causality or socio-political causality. They're connected, but they're connected in ways that are not one directly related to the other. So in the religious sense is when we say that can never be like the Prophet ﷺ. Now, was the Prophet ﷺ, was it the most prosperous society in the world? No. Was there zero crime? No. Was there never any divorce? No. So in what indicator would you say, according to what social indicator would you say that the Prophet's society was perfect? In a different matrix. So, going then to the question of does traditionalism require us to be fatalist? No, but it requires us to be humble in this domain. That's all. Meaning that when you see poverty, when you see suffering, you don't say, I know, dude, you're really poor, but the Prophet's time was perfect. I could have given you some money then. But now suffering is pretty common, and gotta deal with it, right? So, right, we don't argue like that, right? The same is true. We can't argue. If you take that argument, there is no reason why we should not reflect on how to. We cannot eliminate poverty, right? As a metaphysical sense, you can't be a Marxist and say there will be another world in which there will be no poverty. That is the violation of this idea that there was perfection, because what that idea requires is that human beings, regardless of its atheism, what it says is that human motivation will fundamentally change if we have a better relationship with our production. And everybody will be happy, hunky-dory. Everybody will just love to make a chair and make it beautiful. And no need for government, no need for poverty. Elimination of poverty is different from sadaqah, charity, zakat, justice, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us different. That's not going to end, right? So that kind of society is called utopian society. Utopia is not what we are talking about. Now, often when people accuse political Islam of being utopian, these people, in my view, are just sectarian polemicists. Because political Islam, with the exception of a few Khawarij type people who abandon society, majority of reformists have never said that. They are very clear about what they want. They want to work within the parameters of the modern inventions, modern society, in order to improve. They may be wrong, but what they're not is just simplistic utilitarians, right? So I am very much against any group trashing others among Muslims, because there is good and there is argument that's really everywhere. You find an element of the Sunnah, an element of the Quranic message that different people are holding on to. So my point is that it's that utopianism, however, right, that often more secular Muslims are likely to fall into, which is that it's possible to eliminate poverty by coming up with a brilliant system, which is different from saying that we have a tyrant, we have to find ways to better hold ourselves accountable, and the fatalist argument that, look, we have Bashar, and Bashar, anybody, this guy, you know what, he belongs to this tiny minority that the worst security state in the world, and there is nothing we can do about it because God has put us in this situation. Well, you could argue that same about Salah. Like, it's pretty hard. God has put me in my situation, which is that I really like this movie, and why should I, So this kind of argument does not hold up. In other words, fatalism is fatalism goes against the fundamentals of Islamic law, which says you undertake action in order to pray, in order to be just, in order to do al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, requires initiative. Even more so, the general commandment to do good, which is Allah says, "Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan." Al-adl and ihsan. Allah commands you to do justice and to do favor, to act beautifully. This is not connected to any particular commandment, which means it's your job to find where justice is. What is just in this situation? And if racism is unjust, then removing it is justice. And that is part of this verse. Whereas, you may have an ayah, right, that's talking about making tayammum in certain situations. And giving you a certain legal conveniences. Now there is this element of, so there are two kinds of ahkam, two kinds of rulings. There are particular rulings and general rulings. Particular rulings, khas, is the foundation, if you will, the structure, the stable structure of Islamic life, Islamic law. But then there are general commandments. And if you reduce Islam to the literal following of just those commandments, what you have to turn away from the general commandments, which says establish justice and do good. And when are you going to do that if all justice is already in following the particular commandments, right? So this notion that we are simply supposed to keep our head down, follow our personal commandments, whatever we can, and not try to change our situation, because that goes against tawakkul, that goes against trust in God. That fatalism, in my view, is never justified. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask this sort of attitude that you're describing in terms of, I'd say activism. How common has that been among Muslims themselves throughout history? Because you find in history among the even among some of the caliphs that were quite horrible, and many Muslims, at least majority of Muslims, did little to nothing about it. It seems. So.
It seems.
It seems,
and that's what we're going to see, why that's not the case. But that's a very good question. It's one of the themes that I think is going to come up again and again. That Islamic history, so you take any region and you look at what were the major events that shaped that region. So North Africa, for example, sort of a little bit far away from the center. History of North Africa, very traditional Maliki Ash'ari region, is punctuated by what? There are Al-Muravids, Al-Murabitun, an activist, militant conquest movement. Al-Muwahhidun, Al-Muwahhads after that, who are practically the same as the Wahhabis. Their doctrine, their practice is exactly the same as the Wahhabis, except that they are Ash'ari or super Ash'ari rather than super Ahl al-Hadith. But other than that, they are the same. And look at recent history, the Sanusiya order, the Sufi orders, the Osman Dan Fodio order. Islamic history is punctuated by every century by these major activist movements that say enough is enough. The same is true of the Umayyad period. There are a dozen major rebellions in the 90 years of Umayyad period. So the idea of quietism is invented only relatively late, and we'll talk about why it becomes an attractive ideal.